The dinner table went quiet the second his hand hit my face. Callum had been talking about the mortgage numbers wrong for 10 minutes, and I only corrected him once, softly, without any edge in my voice. He didn't even pause before he swung. The sound was sharp and small, like a book closing. My cheek burned. My wine glass tipped and a red stain spread across the white tablecloth, but nobody moved to blot it. Nobody moved at all. Nolan's hand froze around his glass. The ring he always tapped against it caught mid-motion. Evelyn's hands slid into the pockets of her coat, the way they always did when she didn't know what to do with them. Marla kept stirring her tea, slow circles, long after the sugar had dissolved. Callum straightened his left cuff with 2 fingers, the way he always did right before he said something cruel, and he looked at me like I was the one who had done something wrong. "Now apologize," he said. "You embarrassed me." His voice was calm. That was the worst part. He wasn't even angry anymore. He was just certain. I didn't apologize. I sat back down in my chair and folded my hands in my lap and said nothing. Someone cleared their throat. Someone else asked if anyone wanted more bread, and the conversation limped forward around the silence I left behind, the way water moves around a stone. Nobody asked if I was okay. Nobody looked at the wine stain either, though it kept spreading, soaking into the fibers of the cloth, and I remember thinking that stain would never fully come out no matter how many times it was washed. Some things just sit in the fabric of a thing forever. It had not always looked like this. 6 years ago, at the company holiday party, Callum had introduced me to his colleagues as the smartest person in the room, and he'd meant it, or he'd wanted people to think he meant it. Somewhere in the last 3 years the sentence changed shape. Now he introduced me by apologizing for me before I even opened my mouth. "She gets emotional," he told his coworkers at a company dinner in the spring, laughing like it was an inside joke between old friends. I had said one sentence about the budget. One. He turned to the table and said I always dramatize things, that I take everything personally, that he loved me anyway. People laughed along with him because laughing was easier than asking questions. I sat there and smiled because that was easier too. I had gotten so good at making my face agree with the room even when nothing inside me agreed with anything. At the same spring dinner, later, in the parking lot, he told me quietly that I'd embarrassed him again, this time for laughing too loudly at something one of his coworkers said. I hadn't laughed loudly. I had barely laughed at all. But arguing the detail never changed the outcome, so I said I was sorry, and he softened instantly, wrapping an arm around my shoulders as if nothing had happened, steering me toward the car like a man escorting someone he loved. That was the pattern. Correction, apology, warmth, repeat, so seamless that most weeks I couldn't have told you where one stage ended and the next began. His mother had a phrase for it, back then, the first year we were married. She called it him having a strong personality, said it fondly, the way you'd describe a man who liked his coffee a certain way. Even Owen used to say it, half joking, in front of other people at the office holiday parties. Callum runs a tight ship at home, he'd say, and everyone would laugh, including me, because laughing along was the only version of the joke that didn't end badly for me later that night. I had started keeping a private inventory somewhere in the back of my mind, a list of small warping moments nobody else seemed to notice. The tightening of his hand on my arm at a party when I spoke to another man too long. The way he'd go silent and pleasant in public, then colder in the car, 2 versions of him that never once appeared in the same room at the same time. I didn't call it anything back then. I'd just carried it. His mother never helped. The first time Callum snapped at me in front of her, over something as small as a dish left in the sink, she watched him do it, and then turned to me and said, quietly, "Don't argue with your husband. Not don't hurt her. Not stop. Just don't argue with your husband," like the argument was the problem and not the hand that ended it. She said some version of that sentence to me for years, always calm, stirring her tea the entire time. Her calm wasn't peace. It was practice. I had learned to swallow things. I swallowed the comment at the holiday party. I swallowed the joke at his birthday dinner about how I couldn't be trusted to plan anything without ruining it. I swallowed the afternoon he told me, in the kitchen, with the water running, that if I ever tried to leave I would find out how little I actually had, how little was really mine. I didn't understand yet how literally he meant that. I only understood that I nodded and turned off the water and finished making dinner because that was what the last 6 years had trained me to do. Swallow it, smile, keep the house quiet, keep him calm, and somewhere underneath all of that, keep breathing. The friendships had thinned because Callum found reasons to dislike the people I was close to. My job before Dana's offer had been part-time, something he'd encouraged early in the marriage because it meant fewer arguments about who managed the house, and slowly it had become the only kind of work he would tolerate me having. Even my own opinions had narrowed, folding themselves down to fit whatever space he allowed them, until I sometimes caught myself agreeing with something in a conversation before I had even decided whether I actually agreed. Back at the dinner table, after the slap, after the wine stain, after everyone had gone home pretending the evening had simply run long, Callum came and stood in the kitchen doorway while I cleaned the last of the dishes. He didn't apologize. He never once, in 6 years, apologized for anything with that word. Instead, he said I'd made him look foolish in front of people who mattered to him, that he hoped I understood why he'd reacted the way he had, that he loved me and hated when things escalated like that. I nodded and kept washing a glass that was already clean. He kissed the back of my head on his way to bed, the way he always did afterward, as though the kiss itself was the correction sealing the whole night shut. That night, after the dinner and the slap and the wine stain nobody wiped up, I sat on the edge of our bed while Callum showered like nothing had happened, and I reached for the pendant at my throat. It was a small silver leaf, the first thing he'd ever given me, back when his hands were something I reached for instead of flinched from. I pressed it between my thumb and finger until the edge bit into my skin, a small clean pain I could actually control. I had done that so many times over the years that the habit didn't even feel like a choice anymore, just something my hand did on its own when my chest got too tight to hold. But that night, gripping the little leaf in the dark, something in me sat very still and very awake, and for the first time in a long time I thought, clearly, this is not going to happen again. The next morning Callum left for work in a hurry. He had an early call with a client, and he was already annoyed before his coffee finished brewing, patting his pockets for his keys, talking too fast about traffic. He grabbed his jacket off the back of the chair and was gone before I'd even poured my own cup. It wasn't until I was wiping down the counter that I noticed his tablet still sitting there, screen dark, forgotten beside his mug of half-finished coffee, still faintly steaming. I almost didn't touch it. 6 years of training told me not to touch it, that it wasn't mine to look at, that even glancing at it would somehow become my fault later. But then it lit up on its own, a notification sliding across the lock screen, a name I recognized. Owen. I don't know why I picked it up. Maybe some part of me already knew. The message was still visible without even unlocking the screen, a short line under Owen's name that made the room go very quiet around me. She'll apologize tonight. She always does. I stood there holding the tablet with both hands like it might disappear if I loosened my grip, and I scrolled up, and there was more, an entire thread stretching back weeks, casual, almost bored in tone. The way you'd talk about handling a difficult client rather than a wife. If she ever leaves, she has nothing, one line said. Another, she won't go anywhere, she doesn't have the nerve. I read it twice to make sure I wasn't imagining the calm cruelty of it, the way he'd clearly said these things to Owen more than once, easily, like reciting a fact he was proud of. Something inside me went very still and very clear, the way a lake goes still right before it freezes all the way through. This wasn't a bad temper. It wasn't stress from work or a difficult childhood or any of the excuses I had built for him over the years without even realizing I was building them. This was a plan. He had a system, and I had been living inside it for years without knowing its name. I set the tablet down exactly where I'd found it, the screen already dimming again, and I stood at the counter with my coffee going cold in my hands, and for the first time in a very long time I felt nothing that resembled fear. I felt something colder and steadier than that. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I didn't confront him that night when he came home, tired and normal, like the tablet had never been left open on the counter. I just watched him, quietly, the way you watch whether you've already decided to walk through. And I started, without telling a single soul what I was doing, to leave. I called Evelyn first, because Evelyn was the only person who had never once told me to be patient with him. We met at a small cafe 2 blocks from her apartment, and I told her everything, the dinner, the slap, the tablet, all of it, in a voice so flat it surprised even me. She didn't interrupt. She sat across from me with her hands pushed deep into the pockets of her coat, the way she always did when she was listening hard enough that her hands needed somewhere to go. When I finished, she reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. "What do you need?" she said. Not "are you sure?" Not "maybe you're overreacting." Not any of the sentences I had braced myself for out of habit. "What do you need?" I told her I needed a job that had nothing to do with his name, and a place to put my things where he couldn't find them, and someone who would help me build all of it without asking why more than once. Evelyn knew Dana Whitmore from a volunteer board they'd both sat on years earlier, and within a week she'd arranged an interview for me at Dana's company, a mid-sized firm 2 train stops from my old office, somewhere Callum had never once set foot. I remember sitting in the reception area beforehand, smoothing my skirt with both hands. I felt strangely like a teenager on her first job interview. Years earlier, I had run an entire department before I let that career quietly dissolve into something smaller so it wouldn't compete with Callum's hours. Dana was brisk and precise, the kind of woman who wrote everything down in pencil on a yellow legal pad even when there was a laptop open in front of her, short careful notes in small handwriting while I answered her questions. She asked about the 3-year gap in my resume, and I told her, simply, that I'd stepped back for personal reasons and was ready to step forward again, and she didn't push further than that, just made a small pencil mark and moved to the next question. Something about her steadiness reminded me of Rebecca before I'd even met Rebecca, the sense of a woman who had seen enough of the world not to need every detail spelled out before she decided to trust you. She offered me the position before I'd even left the building, a director role with a salary that startled me a little, and I remember standing on the sidewalk afterward feeling something I hadn't felt in years, which was simply mine. The offer came through my personal email account, one I'd quietly created weeks earlier on my phone during a lunch break, an account Callum had never seen and never asked about because he had never once had a reason to think I needed anything separate from him. I read the offer letter 3 times standing on that sidewalk, and then I closed the email and walked 2 blocks in the wrong direction before I even realized I was smiling. I opened a bank account the same week, entirely online, using digital identification so no paper statement would ever land in our mailbox. I moved a little money at a time, amounts small enough not to trigger a single question if he ever looked, transferring what I could from a shared account he rarely checked into something that belonged only to me. Every transfer felt like breathing through a straw, careful and slow, but each one added up. I photographed my first paycheck stub the moment the deposit notification came through, then closed my phone and put it face down on the table and didn't spend a cent of it. It sat there untouched, like proof I was keeping for a court I hadn't even scheduled yet. Evelyn found me an apartment through a friend of hers who managed a small building on the other side of the city, and we signed the lease using her address for all the correspondence, so nothing would ever arrive at the house I still, for now, had to keep sleeping in. I began carrying things out slowly, a scarf here, a folder of documents there, a framed photograph of my sister that I could claim I'd simply misplaced if anyone asked. Nobody asked. Callum had stopped noticing the small details of my life months ago, the way you stop noticing furniture you walk past every day. He noticed only the large gestures, whether dinner was on time, whether I agreed with him at parties, whether I apologized quickly enough when he decided I needed to. Rebecca Sloan was a name Evelyn gave me on our 3rd meeting at the cafe. She was a family law attorney who worked 2 floors above Dana's office. I called her the same afternoon. Rebecca had a quiet, unhurried way about her, the kind of calm that didn't come from not caring, but from having done this so many times that panic was no longer useful to her. Every time I brought her a new document, she would take it from me and align the edges square against the desk before she even read it, a small ritual, as if she was giving each piece of my life the order it had never been allowed to have inside my marriage. She kept everything in a locked file at her office, never in her car, never anywhere Callum might accidentally see it. No half measures, she told me, the first time we met. When we go once, and it holds. On a Tuesday when Callum thought I was at a dentist appointment, I sat in a small clinic across town instead. A doctor I'd never met photographed the fading bruise on my upper arm and wrote down, in careful clinical language, what I told her had caused it. Rebecca filed that note into the folder and squared its edges with the rest. This piece mattered more than almost any other, she told me. Pain fades. Paper doesn't. It was Rebecca who said the sentence that stayed with me longest on one of those afternoons. You are not building a case against him, she said. You are building a floor under yourself. The change in me during those weeks confused him more than any argument ever could have. When he raised his voice about something small, I simply agreed and offered him nothing to push against. I watched him grow uneasy, watched him start adjusting his cuff more often, as if his own hands had started sensing something his mind hadn't caught up to yet. He only knew that whatever lever he used to pull now moved nothing. One evening he tried a different approach entirely, softer than usual, sitting across from me at dinner and asking, almost gently, whether something was wrong between us. For one unsteady second, I nearly told him everything, some old reflex toward honesty rising up out of habit before I caught it and folded it back down. I told him instead that I'd just been tired from work, and he accepted it, relieved, because a tired wife was a problem he already knew how to wait out. He didn't know that the job tiring me out was one he'd never approved, one he didn't even know existed. He didn't know that the fatigue in my face came from spending my evenings photographing documents in the closet with the door shut, or from the hour I'd spent that same week sitting in Rebecca's office listening to her explain, calmly, what a judge would and would not find persuasive. There was one night, near the end of that stretch, when he came home late from a work event and, a little unsteady from the bar, tried to pull me into an old argument about money, the same one that had ended with his hand across my face weeks earlier. I watched him build toward it, watched his hand rise to his cuff out of habit, and instead of bracing the way I always had, I simply said, calmly, that I didn't want to discuss it that night, and I walked into the other room. He didn't follow me. He stood there a moment, muttering to himself, confused, the way a man is confused when a door he's used to kicking open turns out to already be unlocked and swinging on its own. It was a small moment. It was also the clearest sign yet that the old rules no longer applied to me. By the end of those weeks, I had a job with my name on the door, a bank account he had never once seen a statement from, a lease with my signature on it 2 neighborhoods away, and a folder in a locked drawer in Rebecca Sloane's office containing everything I would ever need to prove exactly what my marriage had actually been. Callum knew none of it. He still came home every evening expecting the same house, the same quiet, the same woman who apologized when told to. A few weeks later, Callum decided to host another dinner, the kind he loved. Friends gathered around good wine and better lighting, an audience for whatever performance he'd planned that night. He'd been telling people I'd been acting strange lately, distant, ungrateful, laying the groundwork the way he always did before an evening where he intended to correct me in front of witnesses. I knew what he was building toward before he said a word of it, because I had watched him build the same structure a dozen times over the years. This time I let him build it. I even helped him choose the wine. Everyone arrived on time. Nolan tapped his wedding ring against his glass before he'd even sat down, that nervous rhythm he fell into whenever a room felt tense. Evelyn's hands slid into her coat pockets the instant she stepped through the door, watching me across the room like she already knew tonight was different. Owen adjusted his glasses, unaware I now knew exactly what his name looked like in a message thread he'd probably forgotten existed. Marla asked for tea instead of wine, the way she always did, and began stirring it the moment it was set in front of her. Callum waited until the plates were cleared before he started. He straightened his left cuff, the small tell I had watched for years without understanding what it meant, and he told the table, in that same calm, certain voice, that I'd been behaving oddly lately. Distant. Ungrateful. He said it like he was simply sharing a concern with people who loved us both, and for one long second the old fear tried to rise in my chest out of pure habit. I let it rise, and then I let it pass through me, and I reached instead for the folder sitting beside my chair. Rebecca was already at the table, seated quietly near the end, having arrived 20 minutes before anyone else under the simple explanation that she was a friend of mine from work. I set the folder in front of Callum without a word. Inside were the messages between him and Owen, printed clean and dated. Photographs of the bruise on my arm from the spring, alongside the doctor's note I'd finally gotten weeks earlier, once I understood I would need it. The signed filing for divorce. Bank statements from an account with only my name on it. Proof of a lease, proof of a job, proof of an entire life he had never once seen me building right under his hands. The room went the same kind of quiet it had gone the night he first hit me, except this silence belonged to me. Nolan's ring stopped moving against his glass, his hand frozen mid-tap. Marla's spoon slowed in her cup and, for the first time in 6 years, stopped completely, the tea going still and untouched in front of her. Owen looked down at the papers and went pale, adjusting his glasses once more with a shaking finger. He said, quietly, that he'd known for a long time. Callum joked about it often enough, he admitted, that people at the office had started to notice something wasn't right. He was sorry he'd never said anything sooner. The room shifted the moment he spoke, disbelief sliding slowly into something closer to shock, faces around the table turning toward Callum instead of me for the first time in years. Callum reached for the folder with both hands, flipping through the pages too fast, trying to find an explanation, a context, some sentence that would put the room back the way he liked it. His right hand moved steadily enough, turning page after page, but his left hand shook, just slightly, just enough that I could see it from across the table, the same hand that used to straighten his cuff before every cruel, quiet thing he said to me. Nobody at that table reached to help him make sense of it. Nobody laughed along this time. Nolan set his glass down entirely. Evelyn kept her hands in her pockets, watching him the way you watch a fire you're no longer afraid of. Marla said nothing at all, which from her, after 6 years of always saying something in his favor, was its own kind of collapse. Rebecca gathered the papers back into their folder without a word, squaring the edges one final time before she slipped it into her bag, and gave me a small nod that meant it was done, that there was nothing left to add. Dana, who had come as my guest for the evening under the simple cover story of a coworker, quietly reached over and closed her hand around mine under the table. The same steady gesture she used whenever she wanted someone to know they weren't imagining what they'd just accomplished. Nobody at that table offered Callum an exit. Even Owen, who had spent years laughing along with him, sat with his hands folded and his eyes down, unwilling to meet him. He caught up with me outside afterward, in the driveway, his voice smaller than I had ever heard it. He wasn't shouting anymore. He said we could fix this, that he'd get help, that I didn't have to do it this way. He reached the end of the sentence and, out of pure habit, out of 6 years of muscle memory, said it again, the same 2 words that used to end every argument in his favor. Now apologize. I looked at him standing there in the driveway light, and for the first time in years I felt something close to calm settle over the whole of me. I reached up and closed my hand around the little silver leaf at my throat, not out of tension this time, but simply because it was mine and I wanted to hold it. I smiled at him, small and steady, and told him no. I told him that tonight he would leave without the one thing he had always assumed was guaranteed. Then I got into my car and drove away, and in the mirror I watched him standing alone under the porch light, his hand rising automatically to straighten a cuff that no longer had anyone left in the world willing to agree with what came after it. A person who needs you to apologize for their cruelty was never looking for peace. They were only ever looking for power. I don't regret leaving the way I did, quietly, with every document in order before I said a word out loud. But some nights I still wonder if I gave him one chance too many. What do you think? Tell me in the comments, and if this story moved you, like and subscribe for more.